Metal Gear Solid is one of my favorite game series ever. From the not so humble beginnings on PSX, to the series' heyday on PS2, and even the 2 weaker follow-ups have a special place in my heart. And all of these games were the result of the vision of mainly one man, the now infamously cryptic Hideo Kojima. He didn't just make good games. MGS2 and 3 are arguably both among the best the medium has to offer, each for their own little differences. 2 likes to joy with the player, subverting all expectations they might have, be it in story or in gameplay. It asks questions on the nature of video games and the inherent interactivity they have in a way that flows natural to the story. It also helps that the game has a really solid core gameplay loop. Contrary to that, 3 is much more grounded. Well, as grounded as Metal Gear can be at least. Aside from being my favorite in the series, it has an undeniably gamey feel to it. Every new room is a new challenge, a new puzzle to solve. All games had their turn extent, but 3 gave you the tools to tackle each problem the way you wanted. In addition to that, the story of 3 is maybe one of the best executed stories I've ever seen, be it in games, books or whatever. So yeah, you could say I like the games. And by extent, their creator, the previously mentioned Hideo Kojima. It's no surprise then that I wanted to branch out and play his other body of work. And as it so happens, did Zone of the Enders 2, the game he released in between Metal Gear Solid 2 and 3, recently get a Steam port. It's actually called Zone of the Enders, the second runner Mars, but that's a hassle. I went in completely blind, without even playing the first one. I mean, there had to be a reason they only ported the sequel, right? Whatever the case may be, Zoe 2 tells a self-contained story that doesn't feel like it's missing a prequel, so I'll review it as such. Now then, is Zone of the Enders 2, in my opinion, worth the loose title of a Hideo Kojima game? Is it even a good game? And maybe most importantly, what exactly is the Zone of the Enders? Find out now. Okay, so long story short. Kojima-san made a few games about some giant robots, and then he made a few other games about giant robots, before making yet more games about giant robots, but like the first ones. Afterwards, he founded his own studio, with the logo being another giant robot. Guess the dude likes his Japanese anime. He did this work under the company with the probably worst decision-making skills in history, Konami. Any questions? Okay, then let's get into the game. The year is XXXX, in the probably very distant future. Electricity has gotten obsolete after humanity discovered Metatron, a very useful plot device, mostly. Giant mechs called orbital frames are the epitome of fighting units, but they've gotten rarer and rarer over the time. Much more common are the laborious extra-orbital vehicles, or LEVs for short. It just so happens that the ex-soldier Dingo finds the estranged orbital frame Jehuty and its AI, Ada, setting the story in motion. After a few complications, he reunites with his former boss Snowman, who is also the runner of Anubis, a frame with ties to Jehuty. They both talk a bit about their past, and after a slight disagreement in work ethics, Dingo gets shot dead, as you do. But not to worry, because he gets revived by Ken, who proudly proclaims to be a spy for the good guys, before basically straight up forcing Dingo to save the world. Right off the bat, I gotta say, the game looks pretty damn good. Sure, it's on the blocky side, but the beautiful high-res textures and some anti-aliasing do wonders in reinvigorating even a 15-year-old PS2 game. Especially Jehuty looks good enough that I could mistake it for a modern remake of itself. It's just timeless. So timeless, in fact, that I couldn't help but notice the blurry after images effect that was laid over almost every cutscene. But thank God there's a still photo mode that disables that visual diarrhea and leaves only the crispest image. But in all seriousness, enable still photo mode. Why would they have such great looking mechs, only for them to hide them under tons and tons of post-processing? Though I must say, the level design is more on the flat side. Everything is just linear rooms and corridors, aside from some arena-like fights against hordes of enemies later in the game. But still then, Most of the locations are awfully monochrome and samey, with some dungeons only being the same room looped over and over again with different enemies. It also doesn't help that many closed rooms look just a bit too dark. That doesn't make for compelling level design, nor does it make much sense in the world the game takes place. I mean, heck, the prologue area has the same color as Jehuty and most of the enemies. Who made that decision? Metal Gear Solid 2 had the same problem of everything looking the same. And while both games deserve criticism for that, Metal Gear had at least narrative reasons. The secret base was posing as an ordinary oil plant and thus had to look unremarkable and boring. But it doesn't make sense for the scientist in Zone of the Enders 2 to have a miles deep repeating shaft into his laboratory with a security system rivaling basically the whole armament of the US military, even in the future. But credit where credit is due, the scene for the final battle is crazy cool in aesthetic and mechanics. Now, onto the good stuff, the anime cutscenes. Honestly, they're great. It was a great idea of Kojima to put his Japanese anime in the game. I'm especially surprised how good they look, considering how compressed they were in the original release. They give the game most of its charm, even if the animation isn't really groundbreaking. It's only a shame that most anime scenes lack real direction. Aside from maybe the previously mentioned death scene, is most of the shot composition rather boring and flat. Mostly shot reverse shot, and while I've seen better, they are cool nonetheless. But what isn't so cool about the cutscenes is the voiceover. The English voice cast is definitely lacking.
Hey! You must be Taper.
Wow, I'm saved. Thank you.
Baram! I'm not Baram, though this is an orbital frame. Stop.
Also, I can't help but notice that Dingo's voice actor is awfully close to David Hayter Snake in some instances. But not in a cool tribute-y way, more like a cheap knockoff.
Who is he?
Where am I?
One of Ocelot's allies.
Are you serious? Jehuty?
You do?
What?
What?
Don't be so surprised all the time.
Why not?
But even that isn't the worst offender. It's the writing. Thanks to that, all dialogue feels like exposition, like nothing is really happening. There's this one moment in the game that I won't spoil, but late in the game, you defeat your rival and Dingo tries to come to grips with the ensuing situation. But instead of him accepting the circumstances, I thought he was explaining to the player why he did it. It was only when other characters supported him that I realized he was actually trying to be emotional. That was certainly the most egregious example, but far from the only one. That shit happened all the time, to the point where I actually didn't know what was going on sometimes and just followed the waypoint to the next objective. I imagined the Japanese voice cast to be better, at least in delivery. So I downloaded the mod, since the game doesn't really have an option for voice-over language, and this was the result. The timing of the cutscenes is different in English and Japanese, so they get kind of wacky all the time. So yeah, that wouldn't go either, even if I prefer the Japanese voices. And Metal Gear was also wacky at times, but it knew when to pick itself up. For boss fights, for example. And now that I think about it, most major boss fights in Zone of the Enders had something new and interesting to offer. At interesting is where my praise will stop though. Because while the fights certainly never got stale, as they tend to in lesser action titles, they were never much more than forcefully tacked on gimmicks. Kojima is known for always having crazy over-the-top boss fights, but normally these enemies have rich backstories and motivations. The player also sees most of the bosses in action before they actually fight, establishing an air of challenge around them when you finally face them. In Zoe, however, your rival's motivation is literally only to kill you, with no rhyme or reason behind it. And while that has at least some plot relevance, most of the other bosses are the same, only acting as angry husks with a vengeance. They feel like roadblocks for the sake of roadblocks in a game that takes itself way too serious. Or, for Metal Gear fans, imagine every boss fight being the Fury. But if I have something against gimmicky boss fights, that means I actually like the core gameplay loop, right? Well, yes, but actually no. See, the fighting has enough depth to carry at least a few playthroughs. It's not overly complex, but the flow of a good fight feels like any good action game should strive to feel. Imagine Bayonetta, but with only like 2 or 3 combos, but in good. It's hard to describe, but the mix of ranged, melee and grab attacks makes it that there's always another point of attack to react to the enemy. And the honestly staggering amount of sub-weapons makes that pool of possibilities at least the size of a small lake, if that makes any sense. But, and here's the big but, but that's only when everything works in the game's favor. Most of the time, the screen gets way too cluttered by the amount of spawning and respawning enemies, and sometimes even by your own attacks. And it doesn't help that the lock-on is automatic and a bitch to control. You see, I played the game with a controller, and on those, the camera was always the worst enemy in the game, with how it refuses to be decently controllable. Some fights you have to interact with stuff in the environment while fighting. And honestly, I can't remember a more agonizing experience with a game in recent memory. It's honestly the worst. Incidentally, this loops right back into my criticism with the bosses, because while there's only one enemy to fight, they made sure to give them the most flashy moves to fill out most of the screen. I mean, I get it, but it's just too much. So in turn, I died a fair amount of times to some of the bosses, but not in a fair way, mostly only because of their overlapping attacks or because their gimmick isn't really explained that well. The only thing that could make repeat tries of the same boss fight bearable is the soundtrack. And luckily, the soundtrack's really good. Most tracks have a solid beat, punctuated by a woman singing a non-existent language to make it sound like some kind of exotic choir, making the fight sound personal and distant at the same time. And if you think that sounds vaguely familiar, some years later there was another game series that utilized a very similar style. I should really get around to play that. The most iconic track in the Zone of the Enders 2 soundtrack is without a doubt Beyond the Bounds. Not only is it the main theme of the game, it's even remixed into almost every other goddamn song in the OST. And even though the song is such a banger and was remixed into so many songs, how is it not the final boss theme? In my opinion, this would have been the perfect way to end the game. A climatic battle bringing everything together. Not only that, but the actual final boss theme is maybe the most bland song of the whole OST. In summary, the game wasn't terribly bad, but it was much more of a pain than it should be. More than it had to be. The visuals are great after a few tweaks and hold up surprisingly well. The music is really good and the main theme is instantly recognizable. Should you play the game on PC and experience crackling sound, change your headphone properties to 38,000 Hz or higher. That should do it. The gameplay, while rough around the edges, had streaks of brilliance that showed me what it could have been, even if what we got was much too unpolished for such a combat-heavy game. The story is where the game really dropped the ball though. The bad writing, coupled with the mostly one-note voice acting, threw me out of the story at every possible turn. Which is strange, considering the stellar job Kojima did with Metal Gear's English cast. All in all, it's not what my nostalgia would call a Hideo Kojima game, but after taking off my rose-colored glasses, I can see his trademark style all over the game, in every facet of it. The game goes for €30 where I'm from, and it took me around 6 to 7 hours to beat. That's very short, but many people herald the game for having massive replayability, in addition to Kojima's famous VR missions. Those don't really entice me, but there is a versus mode, where you can fight against a CPU or a friend for a local 1v1 mecha battle, which is maybe one of the coolest possible modes in such a game and probably the only reason I would play it again. But even if I don't, that's okay. After all, I finally played this game after so long, and finally understand what all the fuss is. Wait, wasn't there another thing? Probably not. Well, see you next time. I could swear